Okay, following the Civil War, and now that we've gone through Reconstruction, and we've gone through the move out west, now we're going to come into the Northeast. And we're going to look at the growth of cities and how the Northeast changed due to immigration. So in these images, you can see how cities looked back in the late 19th, early 20th century. You can see the common markets and what was for sale at these times. You can see the change in what we buy and what we don't buy. A Frankfurter or a hot dog, 2 cents, or 3 for $5. Sandwiches, 3 cents each, or 2 for 5 cents. Cakes, 1 cent, 2 cent, 3 cent. Pies, 3 and 5 cents. Milk could be 2 or 3 cents. So you see how much things cost back then, and think about it compared to how it costs now. So urbanization. So the cities in America grew largely following the Civil War and Reconstruction period all the way through the early 20th century due to movement away from the farms in the South and into the North, Northeast, and West, as well as the admission of the new states into the Union. So, key idea, industrial growth led to city growth or urbanization. Pretty simple cause and effect. Industrial growth moving into urbanization. Such concentration and packing of a population has probably never been equaled in any city as may be found in particular localities in New York. That was an official Council of Hygiene and Public Health statement. So New York was a city that definitely grew during this time period, and that's when you have the rise of apartment buildings, tenements, and people stacked upon people. So what cities grew during this time period? You've got New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Cleveland all grew really, really quickly. Why did those cities grow? Thousands of African Americans fled the South to live in the northern cities. Remember, that's called the Great Migration. And then how did city life affect housing? You've got the creation of tenements, or very low-cost apartment buildings designed to house as many families as possible, and slums, which were overcrowded, impoverished neighborhoods. The problem with slums was that they were very overcrowded, they were unsanitary, there was a lot of disease, and a lot of fires. Think about it, they didn't have indoor plumbing at this point in time. So you were going to the bathroom in a pot, and that basically could get dumped out the window into the streets. Could you imagine walking on the street and all of a sudden, you have somebody's waste dumped on you? So that was a big problem. And so the sewage systems weren't that great either. So often the human waste and the animal waste from the horses and the cows and all that stuff just lay in the middle of the street. So disease also spread really quickly in this overcrowded area. Think about schools and hospitals when people are really sick, or in the middle of flu season. Think about how it's been the last several weeks. People get sick, they still come to work, they still go to school, whatever. They get their germs everywhere and get everybody else sick. It spreads very, very quickly in schools like that. That's how it spread in the tenements. They were all on top of each other, so everything spread really quickly. And because everybody's on top of each other, it's likely to cause fires. Remember that electricity was fairly new. A lot of people had fires indoors. You got a lot of problems involved. So tenements and slums led to a lot of problems. How did city growth affect housing? So housing shortages led cities to grow upward and then outward. So they expanded in height and in width. Factories in large cities provided jobs, but workers' families often lived in the harsh conditions crowded into tenements and slums because they didn't exactly make a whole lot. So life in the tenements and slums. The next several images you're going to see will show you what it was like. You're on top of each other. What you have for stuff is very minimal, but then it's also on top of each other. This is the start of really indoor plumbing at this point in time. So you can see the pipes that come into the house, and you have a bath basically in your sink. This is how many people shared a tiny little bedroom. So not only did the adults share the room, but then the children had to share the room too. Can you imagine having to share a room not only with your grandmother, but with your 2-year-old baby brother? I mean, that's a lot of people in your room and varying age range as well. So tenements of the old style, so you can see that lots and lots of rooms are built together. These rooms were generally meant to be full apartments that would be like 3-bedroom rooms, or 3-bedroom apartments. Well, they became 1-bedroom tenements and stacked up upon each other. So that became a really big problem, not to mention a fire hazard. So what impact did city growth have on public transportation? The New York City started building the world's first subway system. And most cities started trolley or streetcar services, which connected the suburbs, or residential communities outside the city, to the city. So this enabled the wealthy to live outside the city and still work in the city. So this is when you have your first, move to commute into the city. In 1888, we have the first streetcar in Richmond, Virginia, which that's an image of it. So all of this helps contribute to the growth of the industry. Remember that the growth of industry leads to urbanization. So urbanization and growth of industry kind of go hand in hand. So in the years following the Civil War, the U.S. developed into an industrial powerhouse. Inventors and scientists were backed by business leaders, and they created an explosion of inventions and improvements. Technological change then spurred the growth of industry, primarily in the northern cities. So, what was daily life like in 1865? There was no light. The rising and setting of the sun dictated the rhythm of a day's work, since indoor electric lighting didn't exist at this point in time. So, no lights like that. There was also no refrigeration, so people sawed blocks of ice out of frozen ponds during the winter, packed them in sawdust, and then stored them in ice houses for later use. So, no refrigerators either, so you didn't exactly keep food for a very long time. You had slow communication. Most mail from the East Coast took 10 days to reach the Midwest and 3 weeks to get to the West. It took several months for news to cross the Atlantic. Think about, in the past several weeks, all the news that we've gotten from overseas. The attacks in not only France, but throughout the world, and we learn about it basically instantly. So communication back then was very, very slow. You also have the development of the corporation. A corporation is a form of business organization that enables a group of individuals to operate as a single legal entity. The major advantage of that is a limited liability corporation. So your personal assets cannot be seized in order to pay for the business expenses. So say I own a business and I have a whole lot of debt in that business. Well, if I have a limited liability corporation, an LLC, because I owe money in the business, they cannot come after my house, my car, any of my bank accounts, my personal bank accounts, to pay for the business expenses. A lot of the industrial leaders used the corporation in order to build huge businesses. So steel processing became very profitable in 1857 by Henry Bessemer. He created the Bessemer process, which was a cheap and easy way to make the steel. This is an example of what the Bessemer process looks like. They go into these huge, you pour the molten steel into these giant vats, and it helps create it cheaply and quickly. This is a current Bessemer steel process vat processing steel. So it made it possible for trains to carry heavier loads on steel tracks instead of iron. It's a lot cheaper and it's a lot easier to deal with. And you were also able to build taller buildings with steel, as it is lighter than iron. So it definitely spurred urbanization quite a bit. The Brooklyn Bridge was one of the first steel bridges thanks to the Bessemer steel process. Thomas Edison, so you should know this name, he should be really familiar to you. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. He made electricity a viable source of power and light. Fun little fact about Thomas Edison, the light bulb that he created, it's still lit. It hasn't burnt out since he created it back several years ago, and it's still lit. You can go see it, and the reason that our light bulbs burn out now is because if we all just bought 1 or 2 light bulbs for whatever we need them for, the companies would never ever make money. So they had to create a version of the light bulb that would burn out so that they can continue to make money. So Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, that's another name you should know by now. He developed the telephone in 1876, and by 1900, 1.5 million telephones were in use. The Wright brothers, think flight. Orville and Wilbur Wright achieved the first powered, sustained, and controlled airplane flight in 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So that was a really, really big deal for the time. Controlled and sustained, so they could control where the plane was going, and they could keep doing it for more than a few seconds. So Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, there's that huge memorial down there in honor of them. The assembly line in manufacturing. Henry Ford improved the assembly line process. So each worker would complete a specific job in the construction of the final product. The product would move, not the people. So you did the same thing over and over and over and over again all day, but the product kept moving so that it could continue progressing. So this is an image of an assembly line. Another image of assembly line, putting an engine into a car. So before and after. Before the assembly line, you've got manufacturing where specialized custom products, so products were built by one expert from the beginning to the end, and it was very time consuming to make the products. It was also very expensive to make the products. After assembly line manufacturing, you have standardized products, so they were all the same. Products were built by many workers piece by piece. It was very quick to produce, made it a lot cheaper to produce, and it also made it a lot more boring for jobs. So industrial leaders during this time, you've got the rise of big business thanks to those LLCs and all that. So inventions plus investment equals big business. Andrew Carnegie, he was a big steel person, so he created a huge steel company. He founded steel plants to use the Bessemer process. So Carnegie practiced vertical integration. So that means you own all the steps of the production of steel. So you own everything from the coke fields, which are part of making the steel. He owned those. Then he bought the iron ore deposits, also making steel. He bought the steel mills in order to make the steel. He bought the ships to ship the steel, and then he built the railroads to ship the steel. So he doesn't have to pay for the middleman to transport or to mine or anything like that. He owns all of it. So he owns all the steps of the process of making and selling steel. So Carnegie Steel Company, he owned all the phases of production. So he didn't have to pay any middlemen. He owned all of the steps. So that's called vertical integration. So think about you're building a product from the bottom up, and that's vertical. So he created the U.S. Steel Corporation in 1901, and he controlled 60% of the steel business with that. J.P. Morgan, he was big in finance. He was an investment banker, and he created holding companies where you bought enough stock in other companies in order to control those companies. So his company, United States Steel, bought Carnegie Steel. John D. Rockefeller was big with oil. He had Standard Oil. He practiced horizontal consolidation. So you had vertical integration with Carnegie. Now with Rockefeller, you have horizontal. So he owned most of the oil refineries, 90% of them, which drove down the prices and bought out his competitors. The result was a monopoly, where one company controlled the price and supply. So he owned all of the independent oil refineries. He purchased them, and he created them as Standard Oil Company. So he owned all the oil refineries, therefore he had the monopoly on them. Rockefeller's lawyer created a new kind of monopoly called a trust. This new trust controlled a high percentage of the nation's oil refining capacity. This became a problem because a lot of people weren't a huge fan that Rockefeller had monopolies like this. Cornelius Vanderbilt, think Vanderbilt University, railroads were his big thing. So he owned New York Central Railroad and the Hudson River Railroad. He was a big proponent of getting like Union Station like made. So he was huge in railroads. Why were these captains of industry able to build such huge businesses? The government policies were very relaxed. You have laissez-faire capitalism, which means very little government regulation. The government stayed pretty hands-off. And then the government also had special considerations. They gave land grants to railroad builders. So the government was basically giving out these huge helping hands to these businesses. And then there was also an increasing labor supply from immigration and migration from farms. So remember, you've got that urbanization. People are moving towards the city for jobs, both African Americans and whites. And then you've got the immigration from people overseas. Think back to what groups were immigrating to the United States during this time period. And then you've also got America's possession of a wealth of natural resources and navigable rivers that help out really with the boom of industrial growth in the late 1800s and early 20th century.